Good evening, depending on where you are located. And welcome to our webinar number 9 on clinical trials and hospital pilots. My name is Frederick Nyberg. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator based here in Singapore. We have an excellent panel today. We have some really interesting topics to cover. I'll get them to introduce themselves in just a moment. What I did want to remind you is that we do these webinars on Thursdays, 10 o'clock to 11:30 Singapore time. Our next webinar will in fact be our final webinar for this series. In 2023 will happen on the 9th of November, and that will cover distribution channels in the US and APAC for medtech, smaller medtech companies. For those of you who may not be familiar with MedTech Innovator, very quickly, we are the world's largest accelerator for traditional medical devices, digital health, and in vitro diagnostics companies. We will have well over 600 companies globally that have gone through our accelerator at the end of this calendar year. Those companies have gone on to raise $7 billion in follow-on funding. And if you are in Singapore or in Asia Pac in about 5-6 weeks time, please join us at the APAC MedTech Forum on the 5th and 6th of December. All of our 24 companies will be there, and you will have an opportunity to meet them all in person and hear them present. And of course, if you are new to MedTech Innovator and would like to either apply or join our ecosystem, please contact us after this event. So with that, let's get started. I'm thrilled to have Anne DeLuca here from Molecule to Market based out of Melbourne. And we have Kenny Carberry here from Alira Health dialing in from Boston. So I will ask each of you to briefly introduce yourself, your organization, tell us a bit about your role and your background. And ladies first. So Anne, welcome.
Thanks very much for the invitation, Frederick. So I'm Anne DeLuca. I'm from Molecule to Market, which is a smallish CRO. We have a team of 10 people in Australia and 3 people in the United States. And so we've been operating since 2012. So that brings us into our almost 12th year now that we're moving into. And we are a team of highly experienced clinical research professionals who have worked through different pharmaceutical companies and CROs and moved in and created a bespoke CRO. So our specialty is partnering with these smaller groups of companies, startup companies, and we like to think that rather than providing a service, we will partner with you and guide you every step of the way through the clinical research process. My background is medical science, so I started my career. Actually, I also forgot to say, when I say highly experienced, most of our staff have over 20 years experience in our team. Some of us moving up into the almost 30 years. So before my 29 years experience in clinical research, I started before that in the medical laboratory space. So I'm quite familiar with hospitals. I've worked in hospitals and had a lot of patient contact. Moved into the clinical research side because I wanted to move away from laboratories but still use our science and being interested in the development of medicines. And so that's it, basically.
Thanks, Anne. And you do, in spite of the name of your company, you do work with medical device companies. They're quite a big proportion of the work that you do, I understand.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, we started calling ourselves Molecule to Market. We originated from pharmaceutical industry, but of course we have worked over the years with a lot of devices. And the beauty about devices is that they are a lot simpler in the regulatory pathway and the clinical research pathway because you don't have to worry about the drug-to-drug interaction, and so they're a lot easier to actually be involved in. So we are happy to guide you through.
Thanks for that, Anne. And Kenny, welcome.
Thanks, Frederick. So I'm Kenny Carberry, Vice President of Clinical Development at Alira Health. Been in the CRO world about a dozen years or so. First half of that was in operations. I was a project manager running our day-to-day clinical trials. the latter few years kind of made the move to what I call the dark side commercial. So I now run the business development efforts for our CRO in the United States, but still maintain a small foothold in operations and a few projects. So try to stay up to date on the latest on goings on in the clinical world. Alira Health in general, we are a CRO, but also a more broad kind of clinical healthcare consulting company. So we have regulatory affairs, the clinical CRO, a market access group that does reimbursement and health economics research, management consulting, and a transaction advisory arm as well. So kind of run the gambit of consulting services from the early stages of development all the way through clinical trials, reimbursement, and then at the exit stage. We're a global company headquartered here in the Boston area, but about half US, half Europe. We have, I think, 8 or 9 offices throughout Europe, 3 locations in North America. We're about 800 or 850 people in total. But really excited to be here. We've been involved with MedTech Innovator for 5-6 years at this point, I think, Brett. So yeah, excited to get to know this year's APAC cohort a little bit better. Thanks for having us.
Excellent. Thanks, Kenny. And Kenny, I'll stay with you for a second. How do you typically engage with smaller companies in the medical device space? And what are some of the, in terms of your experience, key differences from a CRO's perspective in working with a small company versus a much larger client or sponsor?
Yeah, I think about the startups. I think by nature of being an early stage company, have to be nimble and flexible. And so I think an engagement with a consultant has to be the same way. And a lot of times it's acting as like Anne was saying before, it's a partner. It's also a consultant. It's not a transaction. It's, we want to be able to provide the expertise that we have in-house, and having worked with so many startups in the past, kind of anticipating challenges, avoiding pitfalls. And sometimes maybe the startup, they don't know what they don't know, and we can work together to identify some areas that maybe hadn't been considered, make sure the whole roadmap is clear, and find out the best way to get there together.
Great, thanks for that. And Anne, for a smaller company in medical devices or in vitro diagnostics, say, why would they want to work with a CRO as opposed to do things in-house? And when is the right time in the development process to start talking to a CRO?
I'd like to say as early as possible. As soon as you want to run a clinical trial, I think it's reach out to us. What's the advantages of not having an in-house versus of coming to a CRO such as us? I think that there's there's the financial constraints or the financial savings, because we are happy to walk you through and give you some guidance. And that is all part of, it's actually free until you decide to choose us. We're happy to support you and give you some ideas and some guidance. And then you come over to us when you're ready to engage us. And that's when your financial impact or investment comes to start, working. But if you have an in-house team, you're actually, and I remember this from when I worked at Pfizer, when you've got downtimes, for example, if your product is held up by a regulatory pathway, a regulatory approval process, then you're paying for your staff to be waiting around for the work to start. The other thing is, they've come to a CRO. The beauty about that is that if you want to run your clinical trial in Australia, you come to or in the US, as for Kenny's team, or any of the offices that he's mentioned, you can go there. What the advantage is that you get local expertise. You get, the landscape. Not only do you know the landscape, but you know it in real time. For example, sometimes an ethics committee might have some experiences where they push back and there's some challenges, or they might be slow, or they close down over certain times of holiday periods. And if you aren't familiar with the landscape, you will get caught up in the red tape, whereas we will give you strategies and bypasses and be a little bit more savvy with what you're doing with the current climate.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, and thanks for that. And I know that you're based in Melbourne. You do work across Asia Pacific. You mentioned Singapore previously, and Korea and Taiwan and so on. And I guess for many of those markets, it may be even more challenging to perhaps manage remotely if you're based in a different market, some of those clinical relationships with principal investigators and hospitals and IRB boards and so on, right?
Well, I think because the time, there's a very small time difference. It's only 2 hours, so that makes it very easy. What we've done in the past is I've been a regional project manager, so we still liaise with the local CROs in the countries that you've mentioned, Frederick.
Yep.
There's lots of different reasons. There's, again, exactly what I mentioned, their local expertise. They know their landscape of their country. But if it's a big global study, they feed into a country like Australia. So then we then deliver the information and we support them. And so we're cognizant of the cultural differences that are between, say, the European or the American companies, and we will modify that. We work with the requirements from each of the Asia-Pac countries, and we filter through. But we work with the CROs to do the monitoring and the regulatory pathway, but we sort of really just collate the information and send it through to the larger overarching clinical trial company.
Understood. That's helpful. And Kenny, what advice would you give to an early stage company in selecting a CRO? How do they identify one? How do they evaluate a CRO? What are the types of capabilities that a startup should look for when selecting a partner?
Good question. I think one of the key items here is you're not just selecting a vendor or a CRO in this case, you're selecting a partner, right? And you need to find a group that can work alongside you and act as kind of an extension of your team. I think smaller CROs like Molecule to Market and Leader Health really understand the philosophy of, okay, you're a 1 or 2 or 3 person company. This is the most important thing that maybe you've ever done professionally, and you need to trust it with somebody, right? So finding someone that understands that and can help identify areas you may need the most help in. Maybe there are some areas that you want to retain in-house as a startup, whether it's for cost savings or things like that, and really being flexible enough to understand, okay, here's what you really need. Here's what maybe you don't really need. It doesn't have to be the fancy Cadillac every time. Here's what we need to provide for you, and here's how we can get there, and really work as an extension of each other's teams in that way.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks. And Anne, you've spent a number of years in this field. What are some of the common mistakes that you come across, avoidable mistakes that you see smaller companies make when it comes to planning and ultimately executing clinical trials?
I think when you're at the planning, sorry, Anne, you want to start?
Sorry, Kenny, I'll hold off. I'll come to you in a second. I did want Anne to ask that question first, if that's okay.
Fine. Sorry, I got all excited.
We're all free to share our information and our experience.
Anne, please go ahead.
Common mistakes, I think. You need a really well-designed protocol. I think it's good we have a medical writer that can review it, if you like, to see how it would be accepted by our ethics committees. Having your documents in place in the first place and having them well written, making sure that's designed well, making sure your toxicology and your pharmacology information for your preclinical data is actually well written in your investigator brochure. Make sure you have a really well-written patient information and consent document. Those things there, and I think are really pivotal. I think also selecting the right investigators. I think we need to remember that the steps all the way through, choosing a key opinion leader. They may not be invested in clinical trials, so you want them to use it at the end, but if they're not committed to recruiting patients, then your study will be delayed, and the time is money. So the longer your study takes to get registered and approved, or your study takes to be registered, is money lost. So you need to be quite strategic in choosing the right sites, and that's usually done with a really good, robust feasibility study that's done at the very beginning. They're the main things I'm thinking, is choosing your sites, making sure your data, making sure your documents are really up to scratch before you submit.
Great, thanks, and Kenny, sorry, I'll let you answer the same question. Your experience is different, comes from a different part of the world, so it'd be useful to have your perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think all those points were great. Along those lines, I might add that in that planning stage, especially if we're talking sites and costs, is really understanding the timelines of the study and how long the study in its entirety can take. One example that I see often is, talking to a startup is, okay, I'm going to be, I'm like 6 months away from getting my trial up and running. Like, I think I'm going to, and I'll be done in 4 months. It's going to enroll in 4 months, right? And I'm raising $500,000, and I'll be good to go. And then having the conversation of, okay, if you're enrolling over the course of 4 months, that means you need to spend this amount of time finding a site or sites, contracting those sites, getting through IRB submission, and that might take 3 or 4 months. And then you enroll, and then you have to shut down the sites, and then you have to do the database lock, and then you have to write your clinical study report, and that might take another 2 or 3 months. So now we're talking about 12 months, right? And maybe twice as much money as you thought you needed. So really taking a step back, okay, from very start to finish, what are all the things that I need, and how long is that going to take in its entirety? And avoiding, having to do, go back to your investors when it's too late and say you need more money, or kind of getting halfway through and your burn rate is toast, and avoiding that kind of mishap. So that's another thing I would add to that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Kenny, typically then how what does a company need to have in place before they reach out to a CRO and before they start planning their trials?
I mean, I think, like I just said, kind of understanding the entirety of what how long things might take, how long each component takes, and then add it all up. But also your regulatory pathway probably should be relatively clear to you. Maybe you don't need to do a clinical trial, right? So you don't want to have to go into one if you don't really need it. Maybe there's a regulatory pathway that avoids a trial altogether. Selfishly, I want everyone to have to do a trial, but and I think also consider reimbursement goals as well, and make sure that those two things are in sync. So if you have a regulatory claim and your reimbursement doesn't necessarily align with that, and then your clinical endpoints don't align with either, you really want to make sure that those are as aligned as possible. So if you have to do a clinical trial, you can do one clinical trial and not have to do a second one later, or a retroactive analysis, and really get all those things in sync. So you do one study, do it right, and then you can have your reimbursement ready to go, your clinical claims ready to go at that point.
Right. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment as well. Yeah. Great point. So at the beginning of our accelerator program, we reach out to the startups that are now in the program, and we typically ask them to bring up questions on a range of topics, including, of course, clinical trial management. So some of these are questions taken directly from our cohort. And a common question here is how and this is I think quite a common question, because many of these startups, they don't necessarily have that clinical experience. What determines sample size? And maybe I'll turn to Anne first on this. How is the sample size determined? How are times and costs estimated typically for a typical pivotal trial in medtech? You're on mute, Anne.
Sorry, I had a bit of a cough. Sorry. I think a sample size is determined. We will speak to our statisticians, and we want to talk about the statistical significance, what the claim is that you want to actually, what you want to derive, and your assurance of what your clinical trial will show. So what we do is we engage our statistician, and that's who ultimately decides how many patients you need to determine the robustness and the assurity of what this study will actually deliver.
Thanks. And Kenny, I know Alira Health has a whole biometrics division, and anything do you want to add there on how you typically involve that group and how you determine sample size, for example, and
Sure.
Ultimately time and cost?
Sure. Also, if you saw me bend down just now, I was picking up this book underneath my desk. Biostatistics for Dummies. So step one, acquire this book. But I think, yeah, so at Alira Health, we do have a biometrics group that includes biostatisticians, and they often work to solve this problem, but also alongside our clinical and regulatory teams to help to develop a clinical protocol. So now you've got your statistical input for the powering, but then how do you best integrate that into the rest of the protocol? And we can do that as well. And I think one thing I was just thinking of too, at least in the US with FDA for regulatory, there can be in some cases predicates that are used for 510K application where you can more or less mimic a study design that's already been done as part of a 510K, that you can come pretty close to your estimated sample size based on the predicate and how that was cleared in the study that they did. That's not going to be true in every case, but it's something that I came across recently where it was for an implantable osteoarthritis device that basically the previous predicate they're using, they just mimicked the study design almost exactly. They're putting that in front of FDA now for an IDE as we speak that we're Leader Health is writing.
Very interesting, because I know a number of companies here on the call are aiming for an initial 510K, and obviously if they can look at what the predicate device had gone through in terms of clinical trials, that's very helpful. But if they're going for a PMA or de novo, how does that then change things, and what you need to factor in?
Yeah, I mean, I think just back to the initial kind of talk to the biostatistician, I think the 510K kind of route is kind of the easy way out. If you can do it that way, great. But I wouldn't go to the bank with those comments. I would also talk to a regulatory person to be sure that'll work. But that's and I maybe I could quickly address the other point of that question, Frederick, too, about the cost. It's a little bit of a different answer, but some of the main costs, I think, in the clinical trial, the main drivers tend to be, well, take a half a step back. There are many things in the clinical trial are unit-based, at least how we price them. We'll speak for molecular market, but the unit-based items, and then some are monthly-based. So basically, say project management over the course of your study is a monthly-based cost, and the units are, number of site contracts you have to do, a number of site budgets you have to do, a number of teleconferences you have, that kind of thing. So the main drivers tend to be the number of sites, number of patients, also the schedule of assessments. So if you have to come in, once a week versus 3 times a week, the more frequent visits are going to be more costly cumulatively over the course of the study, and the total length of the trial. So if you're adding up your monthly units over 12 months versus 24 months, obviously it's going to cost more. But a lot of the main drivers are number of sites, number of patients, because that turns into more monitoring visits, more data to review, more data to analyze at the end of the study, more visits into the clinic or the hospital that you're reimbursing the sites for, that kind of thing. So those are usually the 3 or 4 main components in what can drastically change a budget in one direction or the other.
Very good. Thanks for that. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the regulatory challenges here, that in terms of clinical evidence collection and generating for a company, let's say, based in the US or based somewhere in Asia Pacific, can they typically generate clinical evidence outside of Asia Pacific, let's say in the US, and then use that for regulatory approval in let's say Australia with the TGA, or do you typically need to repeat some of the clinical work locally to meet regulatory requirements?
They've become a lot since July 2021. I've just looked this up recently, and since July 2021, there's a guidance document. So yes, you can use data from outside of Asia-Pac in the EU, but provided they follow the similar regulatory pathway. So I can, following this meeting, I can send the link of the guidance document from the TGA.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thanks.
That is certainly, definitely, the data can be used from over different countries.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. And then Kenny, in terms of US FDA approval, and you touched briefly on this earlier, I guess the first question is, can you use clinical data from outside of the US, let's say in Asia Pacific, to apply for US FDA approval? And is there anything in particular that a startup based in APAC needs to think about to make sure that they're set up to avoid having to repeat clinical work in the US as they go through that regulatory process?
Yeah, it depends, Frederick. So which is a great answer as usual.
Yeah.
In many cases, yes, we've seen data from APAC or other parts of the world used in a submission. And in a lot of those cases, there's additional data collected in the United States to augment that, as opposed to having to redo the study entirely. Maybe it's just safety, or maybe you can use just the safety from the APAC or other regions. So in many cases, it's acceptable. Or I would say probably even in most cases, some at least of that data can be used. It's frequently FDA would then request some additional data in the US. Maybe it's 10 more patients or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be necessarily an entire arm of the study. So you could consider opening, say, a site in the US as part of your study. Say you need 50 patients, you want to roll 40 of them in Singapore, and you can do 10 of them in the United States. Now that's just one study, and you can just do it that way, or in an ad hoc way, add additional data in another small trial later. There's just a couple of ways to get around it.
And would you know if the US FDA would have any preference in terms of countries where they readily accept clinical data and others where they may be a little bit more hesitant? You mentioned Singapore, for instance, and so I assume that's okay. But that's a small market, and there's not a lot of trials happening here.
Yeah, I mean, I would talk to a regulatory consultant for any certain information, but we do see a lot come from Taiwan, for example.
Yeah.
It's just a frequent player that we see. So I'm sure they're comfortable with at least some data from Taiwan too.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Anna, I wanted to ask you about funding trials, and I know that the Australian government have different incentives and so on in place. It's a costly exercise, of course, and it's a key milestone in accessing capital from investors, but a costly exercise. And what are some of the innovative ways that a startup could possibly fund their clinical work in Australia?
Firstly, the value of the Australian dollar is so weak, so that's lucrative in itself at the moment.
Right.
So that's good. But then we also have the Australian R&D tax incentive, and as we've been when I've been to the bio conferences over in the States, I know that when people want to meet the Australian companies, the benchmark, I know that there's other countries that also offer tax incentives, but you can receive up to 43.5% refund in the dollar spent in Australia, provided there are certain requirements that you meet. I can put you in touch with an R&D tax incentive financial expert, but the milestones are, I think the company has to earn less than 20 million, I think it's US dollars per annum. That's one thing you need to be able to qualify. And then the tax experts will help you set up an Australian subsidiary, and you can then conduct clinical trials as a subsidiary. You'll need an Australian director on that subsidiary, and so molecule to market. It would be either myself or Robin Hansen, the other co-founder of Molecule to Market. We could act as your local Australian director, and so we could get that study underway.
Understood.
Tax financial benefit.
Yeah. Thanks. Kenny, are there any incentives in the US for I assume they would only give this to US-based companies. We did speak on one of our webinars last week or 2 weeks ago on setting up a legal entity in the US. So that's certainly on the radar for some of the companies in our cohort. Some already have that. Are there incentives or ways of funding trials in the US that are sometimes overlooked?
I mean, I think everyone's probably familiar with grants. There are government grants. There are also sometimes there are university grants if you're part of a university program. Other accelerators like MedTech Innovator, of course, is the best. But there are plenty of them out there in the US. Other accelerator programs. Also, crowdfunding. I don't know how pervasive this may be in other parts of the world, but It's pretty popular here in the US last couple of years. And I think healthcare sector is finding its way into crowdfunding too. So Alira Health actually acquired a crowdfunding platform a couple of years ago. It's finally launching. So I won't plug it too much, but we do have our own. It's called Red Crow, and it's basically a healthcare only equity-based crowdfunding platform. And so we're launching it, I think, basically fourth quarter here, so coming up pretty soon. And to start, it's accredited investors only, but we are able to open up to all investors. So there are two different ways we can do it. It's pretty interesting. So happy to provide some more information later.
Yeah.
But it pretty much is, the Kickstarter for healthcare companies, and not, you're not next to like a board game on it's only healthcare companies on there. So so it's a little bit innovative. Last couple of years, that's been more common.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And Kenny, you mentioned earlier working with KOLs and KOL networks. What we find very often is that startups turn to the KOLs that they know well to identify and expand clinical sites. But those KOLs may not necessarily be the best clinical site partners and the best principal investigators. What are some of the challenges there, and what advice do you have for choosing and identifying PIs and clinical site partners?
Yeah, good question. I think we see this a lot where just because a KOL or a physician wants to be involved in your trial, doesn't mean you want them to be involved in the trial, right? And I hear a lot, well, I've got these like 3 guys that like really want to get into it. I think it's easy to kind of fall in love with that a little. And it's, of course, KOLs are important to your development, to your program, to your network, to your marketing, absolutely. And maybe they could be good PIs, but just to be cautious that sometimes they're not. And I think, especially at like a large university, for example, here in the US, there's pros and cons of going to that kind of a site where, yes, there's large number of patients available. There might be, cachet. Everyone with an oncology drug wants to go to MD Anderson, right, in Texas, and you get those guys on your publication, but they can take 12 months to open. They're very expensive. There's a lot of red tape. They have committee after committee after committee, and by the time that site opens, you're out of money, right? Your burn rate is really high at those places. So just other things to consider. And when you're looking for the right site, as opposed to a KOL for maybe your board or development a little bit, a place that can be, yes, get you patients, but be a little bit more agile and more affordable, and at least considering those items when you're, instead of just seeing the flashy big name, make sure it's the right fit for your pocketbook and your timelines and those things.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. And Anne, I want to talk a bit about IRB approvals. In Australia, typically, what's the process? How long does it take? With your experience working in other key markets in Asia Pacific, maybe Korea, Taiwan, elsewhere, what are there significant differences in that process, and how long it might take to get those approvals?
Sure. With devices, I'm assuming we're mainly concentrating on here.
Correct.
We tend to go to a lot of private IRBs.
Yeah.
And so we have different pathways. We have one really major one in Australia that's got 12 subcommittees, and that they meet weekly. So, and that they first go through, sorry, they don't do a drug subcommittee. It's not necessary for the devices. But so we do choose, lots of people gravitate to that ethics committee. There's also different ones that we can use. It depends so the timelines for that, we would tend to look at the feasibility, the design of the study, which way it would be, where your sites would be. Sometimes we also have a different setup, but they are private ethics committees, ethics we call them here. And so on average, particularly with devices, I say that it would take about 2, maybe 3 months maximum to get your clinical trial approved. The reason that it's a little bit shorter with devices is because you don't need to go through the drug subcommittee before you submit to ethics. So it actually is a faster pathway. It's quite good. I think the responsiveness, as soon as we usually get a round of questions, and the timeline to get your study approved will depend on how quickly you reply to those queries. And I think it's a case that you get all your queries, you sit down with with the company, and you get a responsive turnaround. It's still fresh in the mind of the ethics committee. So if you're responsive, they will be responsive in return. So I think you just have to make sure that you keep that momentum happening.
Understood. And Kenny, in the US, what's typically the process there, and how long does it take? What can a company expect?
Yeah, it's similar. I think they're probably the startup process in general at a site has, you have a contract in place, the budget in place, informed consent form complete, financial disclosures, medical licenses, basically all the regulatory documentation you need at the site level, and that's then packaged to an IRB. That can be either done locally at the IRB at the site, or in some studies there's a central IRB where all of those sites submit to one place centrally. I think one way to kind of get ahead of that is trying to avoid as much of the back and forth as possible. So making sure that the protocol, for example, and the informed consent form complete, are clear, make sense, and you kind of anticipate any feedback from those committees. And hopefully they just say yes. But if there are conditions or questions, that it's one round of back and forth, and avoid a lot of, because sometimes they'll only meet monthly, right? Or every 2 weeks, and you might just lose a lot of time by just not having, a document that's super clear. So having that be as polished as possible when you submit is a good way to speed it up.
Yeah, makes sense. And your firm has done a lot of work across the region in APAC. What are some of the considerations in running a trial that spans across multiple countries, multiple markets in Asia Pacific? How is that different? What are some of the things that a sponsor or startup company would have to take into account?
We have to be cognizant of different cultures, I think, whilst we have a very different relationship with the doctor and CRO in Australia, where it's quite relaxed, I think we are respectful and understand that it's very different in Asia. So if we're the regional project managers for the CROs, we need to understand that we can't expect those CROs to be able to demand things from the investigators so quickly. I've been in Japan, for example, where we walked in and to see an investigator, and because he felt overwhelmed, there were so many of us, and even I think that we had to go and meet him outside of his office, somewhere else where he felt a little bit less threatened that we'd come in as a push. So I think that we just need to be aware of the different ways things are run in different countries, and modify our technique on how we need to obtain that information according to what makes the investigator comfortable.
Yeah. And Kenny, you do multi-country trials as well. You do a lot of work in Europe and as well as here in Asia Pac. Some key considerations or things to bear in mind for a startup as they plan a multi-country trial. In your case?
Yeah, I would say primarily we're in the US and Europe. I think when we're doing a trial that's in both geographies, I think in some cases we've seen, this is maybe less relevant for a medical device, but something to consider, that in some countries, especially in maybe even towards Eastern Europe, standard of care is different. So if you're planning a study where, okay, we expect this treatment plan to be occurring, we're going to augment it with our device or our drug. and then you try to bring that into Croatia, and they're like, oh, we don't do that here, right? So you're now augmenting that treatment plan. So things to consider like that. And then timing is a little bit different, but not grossly. I think costs can be a little different too. I think in the United States, the site level costs I think are way higher than in Europe, and maybe that's true for Australia too. But at least comparing U.S. to Europe, the what we call the pass-through costs, so the sort of the fees that the site places on, there's each line item of each assessment. We took your vitals twice, we did this, we applied the device, collected your data, time for a site coordinator and to enter data, site for the investigator to review everything. All of it has a line item, and they slap a 35 or 40% overhead on it, and it can really add up. And I think that can be, thousands or tens of thousands of dollars per patient in some cases in the United States. And we'll do the same study in Europe, and like, yeah, $800, right? And it's a lot different from that perspective. So I think planning for that and maybe trying to maybe ask somebody over there or find out what the difference really is, and maybe it can save you a lot of money to just do it in one place, or to do some over there and some over here, and just try to spread it out a little bit. But that's a big cost difference, I think.
Makes sense. And post-market data collection, and developing real-world evidence. What are some of the best practices there in designing and conducting post-market data collection studies?
They're probably the fun studies to do, because your study is already registered. And so sometimes it's a regulatory requirement. Sometimes it's just a post-marketing to encourage use of the product once it's registered. But they're quite easy because you're collecting data that's only additional to what would be a standard of care. Once that product has been approved, you're only collecting unexpected, suspected adverse reactions. And you might be getting patient feedback. You might be developing patient questionnaires and asking if they've what their feel is, if it's a device, for example, how they've felt post receiving what they would have received anyway. So they're far less, they're less regimented. They're a far more relaxed clinical trial. They're almost the fun trials because the safety is being approved. And so then we're just getting the familiarity, and it's also it's really good for the companies, because that improves your marketing side of things when people become more familiar with the drug. Or device.
Or the device, of course. Yeah, great point. And that's perhaps a good segue to hospital pilot programs. And Kenny, you've come across these in the US. Typically, what is a hospital pilot program? How is it different from a traditional clinical trial? Do you want to share some of your thoughts on that and how
Sure.
it's used in the US?
At this point, the device is cleared, and you're preparing for launch into the market. And it's common to, maybe it's your KOLs or a couple of high-performing sites from your trial, and trying to give them a sort of soft launch or pre-launch of the product, have an opportunity to use it a little more regularly, and trying to get their buy-in. Basically, there's marketing cachet, a little bit of real-world evidence, and just having a little bit more data or information and excitement behind the product before you hit launch. And I was joking earlier when we met before the meeting that's when you get that's how you get the 9 out of 10 dentists to agree, right? And so you can say, okay, everyone that we had tested loved it, and then you hit the launch with a few big names behind you, with a little bit more real world information.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Now, for the US, obviously, reimbursement is key, and having payment codes in place is key. At what point do you need to have those codes in place? Can you do? I assume you do a clinical trial, obviously, before you have regulatory approval and before you have your codes. Do you need to have the codes in place to do a hospital pilot?
I don't think so. I would talk to a reimbursement expert, but my understanding is you can have. I mean, you probably have to run it through the hospital that you're doing, make sure they're okay with it. But it's not a requirement, I don't think, to do a hospital pilot. If anything, with reimbursement with CMS, the more data you have, the better, right? So if there is data you can use then
Yeah.
and real world evidence you can point towards, perhaps that improves your reimbursement down the road. So it's not a requirement, and it could possibly help you if you have enough data.
And to what extent does a company like Alira Health get involved in hospital pilots? Is a CRO typically required, or is this something that's more commonly handled by the device companies themselves?
Yeah, I would say a CRO typically is not involved.
Mm.
It's something that I think, at this point, if you're preparing for a launch, you may have a marketing team or a person or a business development person that has done this before and has been hired to kind of help with this process. Company like Alira Health, so we do from our reimbursement and sort of market access group would help with this as well to find out, what information do we want to get from this? How do we use that to best position you in the market? What markets can we go into with this information we've gotten? Things like that. So less CRO, more real world data / market access to use that information to plug you into a market most effectively.
Understood. And I assume for Australia, it's similar approach. And I think your terminology you use there is a little bit different, perhaps as well. When
Yes, we had a device. It was an interesting one where the rest of the world, the device was actually approved. But in Australia, when the clinical trial started, we had to do it as a registration because the paperwork was still in our regulatory for approval at the time. So we were on the cusp of moving from registration to post-registration. And so this study was mainly focused on familiarity with the use of the device so that the investigators were able to feel comfortable with the application of this device was applying a theranostic as a treatment. And so it's learning how to use a device. And it was really a very much a medical marketing type of setup. And so it was a lot. Once we also got the device registered in Australia, the regulations changed and it became a lot easier to finish conducting the clinical trial. And it was all based on using the device and familiarity for the investigators.
Understood. And Anne, I'll just stay with you here. That we had a question that we did have from our cohort, an in vitro diagnostics company asking for an IVD with a goal of preventing disease over 10 to 15 years. Can clinical trials be performed using historical samples, i.e. retrospective, rather than prospective? And which countries would accept this style of analysis? Some of your thoughts on that and doing that type of a trial?
So for diagnostics and collecting data, I think you still need to go back to the ethics committee to ensure that if you're looking at historical data, that the patient's information is all kept. I think you just need to make sure that there's no compromise on patient identity and everything's left quite anonymous. It would be something that we would have to look into from a regulatory pathway. And we would also speak to the ethics committees. I think we'd have to submit something and find out how they felt and how they would process it for historical data.
Thanks. And Kenny, your thoughts on retrospective studies and working with diagnostics sponsors?
Yeah, I don't know about the IVD specifically for this case, but there are some cases where we've leveraged registries to be, say, an arm of your study to reduce the sample size you need to enroll. If there's a product cleared like this, and there's a lot of historical data you can use maybe for safety. If you've basically done something very similar to another device in the market, if its safety is going to be the same, or placebo is maybe going to be the same, you may be able to augment, instead of enrolling 200 patients, maybe you can enroll 150 and you can use 50 of that sort of safety or placebo arm from a registry in your submission potentially. But one thing to be wary of that, pros and cons of using registry data, you're not 100% sure where the data is from and how it was collected, right? So you just want to make sure, do a little bit due diligence on the studies that are involved in that registry if you can, and just be certain that what you're using is high quality.
Yeah, that's a good point. Kenny, artificial intelligence. What are some things that a company should consider if they have an AI component in their device and that is
Yeah.
being used for diagnosis? How does that affect the planning of a clinical trial?
Yeah, AI is really hot right now in the medtech world. I think a couple of things I've come across. One, like you have to make sure that the algorithms you're using are very validated. I don't know if saying very validated is the right thing to say, but you have to be certain that there's a large N in your validation study, and also to kind of stay focused on maybe one goal, one indication. I've seen a couple of companies with AI because you can go in, you can tweak your program a little bit, and all of a sudden you can do 100 things with it, right? And that can be, you can be distracted. You can get a little bit too excited about all the things you can do, and maybe you just focus on validating your algorithm, get on the market, and then go from there. Add your indications, add different treatment areas from there, and not try to do 10 things at once.
Right.
A lot of AI companies try to do that.
Yep. Yep. And do you see companies that are working on AI technologies and algorithms as well in Australia, and how does that affect?
I haven't to this point here. I think America may be leading in that area at this point in time.
Got it. What
Got
I did
it,
want
Ann. We are.
What I did want to touch on, though, before we conclude here, are some of the changes in how clinical studies are managed and conducted. We've over the last few years, we've seen virtual clinical studies, decentralized studies, remote monitoring. For a smaller company in medical devices, what are these concepts, and how do they affect me as a startup, and ultimately how can I as a medical device startup based somewhere in Asia Pacific ultimately benefit from some of these new approaches to clinical trial management? And Kenny, maybe I'll start with you on this.
Sure. Yeah, the decentralized clinical trial world came out of nowhere in 2020, right? And a ton of money was pumped into the industry.
What is it, first of all, perhaps? Maybe we just to make sure that everyone's clear.
Sure. So a decentralized clinical trial or a virtual trial is essentially that a clinical trial with no, we call brick and mortar site. It's not at a clinic. It's purely application driven or telehealth driven, or a device or a drug shipped to your home with instructions. Apply to your skin twice a day for 2 weeks, right? And then there are surveys that you can complete on an app, or there's a Zoom call with the physician, and there's usually one central virtual PI. It's all e-consenting. You're entering your own responses into a system online that's a cloud-based kind of EDC system. So it's purely virtual with no physical contact with physicians in most cases. That companies were born everywhere. A lot of money was poured into it. And then it kind of just fizzled out. And it hasn't really stuck around. I think one thing, there's a kind of a sweet spot has come out of it, though. I think there's been at Leader Health, we do a lot of this, like a hybrid approach, basically, where it's not a full DCT, but there are things that can be done at home. Maybe there are some, instead of coming into the clinic for the day that you just fill out some diaries and go home, maybe that's something you can do, an application-driven diary or survey. Or we've done like a wound care study where you can take a picture of the wound with your phone to measure wound closure, but you still have to go in for other things. So it's reduction of number of visits to the clinic potentially. It's an increase in enrollment if you're considering a trial, and instead of having to go coming in 10 times, I'll have to go in 5 times. Increased retention as well, and compliance as well, because a lot of these applications can send you reminders, hey, take your meds, right? So that has been a strong benefit. So companies that were born to be purely DCT, like CROs, hasn't really worked, but it kind of morphed into other CROs adapting that to fit the sort of classical model of brick and mortar sites with a kind of a occasional sweet spot of hybrid assessments you can do at home.
Understood. And your perspective on this as well. And do you find that decentralized trials, first of all, used to be interesting to understand how that's been generally adopted in Australia and here and elsewhere in the region. But is it something that's more relevant for, let's say, a pharma or startup biotech as opposed to a medical device company?
I agree with Kenny. I think we've got to be very, very careful. I think they became very much the hot topic and very much the flavour of the month during pandemic times, because people wanted to continue conducting clinical trials. There's still a need for it, but how did we do that when everything was locked down? Particularly in Australia, we had so much lockdown, or in Melbourne in particular. So there was a time and place for it. And then this hybrid model is really important. I think we learn from experiences, and there's things that revolutionize. So we develop a hybrid model, and exactly what Kenny said, your recruitment can be good. You have your questionnaires that can be done. It reduces patient burden. They don't need to travel sometimes for 2 hours to the site to be able to do questionnaires, or they can take a photo. And so then we have a lot of apps which are designed for that, which is really good. But I think that the take-home message and the lessons learned is that nothing beats patient contact with the investigator for the critical endpoints of your trial to keep it very robust and assured that human contact, I think we all have to agree that is there's nothing that nothing compares to that. And I think for an investigator to see a wound, to actually see it, is very different to seeing a photograph. And so I think that at the end, when you're reaching your endpoints, back to the clinic is the best way. But in the meantime, we've got these remote visits or decentralized visits. It also comes in really handy. There's a clinical trial. So, for example, in the migraine space, when the patient's meant to take a medication when there's an aura, for example, well, they can't get to the clinic to take the investigational product. So there are times where these decentralized trials have actually been appropriate because your patient recruitment is actually improved as a result of this design.
Makes sense. Thanks for that. Now we're almost at the top of the hour. We're going to go into Q&A here in just a minute. Before we wrap up with our YouTube audience, a few final words, tips, advice from each of you, and I'll turn to Kenny first. Anything that we haven't covered, anything that in particular takeaways you'd like our cohort to think about as they start to plan their clinical trial activities going forward?
Well, this hour flew by, first of all.
It
so
did.
Thanks, Frederick and Anne. This has been a lovely conversation. I think I might just harp back to one of the topics that the three of us discussed at the beginning, that when you're thinking about clinical trial, picking a partner, this is something that, again, you're trusting your baby with somebody, right? And finding the right partner and someone that is going to really work with you and alongside you and understand where you're coming from and what you need to do. It's crucial. And it's, no one ever gets fired for hiring the big box IQVIA icon people of the world, but sometimes finding a small group like Molecule to Market is just what you need. And so I would, caution against looking for the shiny thing and finding the right partner.
Very good. Thanks, Kenny. And any final thoughts from you? Tips or advice?
Yes, I echo what Kenny says, and I also think there's a misconception that bigger is better. And unfortunately, our saying at M2M and actually our ACROS affiliates, which is a group that we belong to for international coverage, is let the elephants dance with the elephants. The large CROs are probably better suited to the large pharmaceutical companies. There's lots of reasons. One is that the large CROs have a lot of an infrastructure, so they cost a lot more. When you're looking at and your finances are limited, that's one thing that's of a concern, because we do it of a much more cost effective. We have a much more cost effective model. The other thing is that I'm speaking from experience belonging to the large CROs and also belonging to large pharma companies, is that the large CROs the really large ones, are interested in repeat business. So they will put their, what we call their A team. They have experienced people, but they will be assigned to their large pharmaceutical companies where they have a pipeline of a lot of drugs and devices. And so that's where their top line top line staff will go. And then you've got the ones that will go to the startup companies will be the more inexperienced people who are still learning the ropes. And unfortunately, that's what tends to happen. When you come to a group like Alira or M2M, where the entire infrastructure is of highly experienced people, you will find that you'll get one person that's committed, and then we'll have backup people, and we will, and again, it's that partnering versus a service provider. So we actually think that we are confident that we provide a more tailored approach and service to startup companies.
Very good. Thanks, Anne. And I assume both of you are okay for us sharing your contact details with our cohort companies.
Absolutely,
so we'll do that afterwards. So don't hang up. We'll continue with Q&A in just a moment. For our cohort companies, you know the process. Please queue up your questions either using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. You just type them in there and we'll call on you in just a minute. Or you can just raise your virtual hand again by using that function at the bottom of your screen. Thank you so much to everyone watching us on YouTube. Great conversation. A big thank you to Ken and to Anne for joining our webinar today. Terrific insights. We'll be back on the 9th of November with our next webinar covering sales, distribution, and commercialization. So do stay tuned for that. And we'll pause here.